In the summer of 1893, the Colorado National Guard rode into the Cripple Creek mining district with rifles drawn and orders that didn't come from any judge. They weren't there to settle a labor dispute. They weren't there to protect property. They were there to seal something underground and make sure nobody talked about it. What happened in the weeks before their arrival has been scrubbed from every official county record. The original mining logs from the Pharmacist Mine, the Independence, and at least 4 smaller operations along Poverty Gulch vanished from the Teller County archives before the county was even formally organized. But the story didn't vanish. Miners talked, their families talked, and one man, a Swedish immigrant named Eric Lindqvist, wrote everything down in a leather journal that wouldn't surface again until 1987, when his great-granddaughter found it inside a false wall panel during a kitchen renovation in Colorado Springs. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. What Lindqvist described in those pages has never been explained by conventional history. And what the Cavalry sealed beneath the granite of Cripple Creek has never been opened again. To understand what they found down there, you have to understand what Cripple Creek actually was before the gold rush rewrote its identity. Because the official story, the one you'll find in every textbook and every tourism brochure, starts in 1891 when a cowboy named Bob Womack discovered gold in Poverty Gulch. That's the accepted origin. A lucky cattleman stumbles onto a vein, word gets out, and within 2 years 10,000 people flood into a volcanic basin at 9,000 feet elevation to tear the mountain apart. But here's the problem with that story. Bob Womack didn't discover gold, he rediscovered it. The Ute people had known about the mineral deposits in the Cripple Creek caldera for centuries. They called the area something that roughly translates to the place where the earth bleeds. Spanish explorers documented unusual rock formations in the region as early as the 1700s, and French fur traders who passed through in the 1820s noted in their journals that the Ute actively avoided certain ravines and cave openings in the area, not because the land was barren, but because they considered it sacred, forbidden. The Ute elders told the French that the underground passages in the caldera weren't natural. They said they were built by people who came before, people who weren't Ute, people from no tribe they knew of. The French dismissed this as superstition. The Spanish never followed up. By the time American settlers pushed into Colorado in the 1850s and 1860s, the Ute had been forced onto reservations, and whatever oral history they carried about the caldera went with them into obscurity. So when Bob Womack found his gold nugget in 1891, nobody was asking why the geology of the caldera was so unusual. Nobody questioned why the volcanic rock formations didn't match any other gold-bearing region in the Rockies. Nobody wondered why the ore deposits seemed to follow patterns that geologists at the Colorado School of Mines privately described as architecturally consistent. Architecturally consistent. That phrase appeared in a letter from Professor Henry Lamb to the director of the U.S. Geological Survey in 1892. The letter was never published. It was flagged, filed, and forgotten. But a copy survived in Lamb's personal papers, which were donated to the Denver Public Library in 1934 and sat uncatalogued for decades. Lamb had visited Cripple Creek at the invitation of mine owner Winfield Scott Stratton, who'd made a fortune off the Independence mine and was troubled by what his crews kept finding at depth. Stratton told Lamb that below a certain level, roughly 400 feet, the rock stopped behaving like rock. The tunnels his miners were blasting through volcanic breccia would occasionally break into open spaces that hadn't been carved by dynamite, smooth-walled chambers, passages that ran straight for hundreds of feet with no deviation, and in at least 2 cases, stairways cut directly into the granite that descended even further into the earth. Stratton wasn't a superstitious man. He was an engineer and a carpenter before he became a mining magnate. He understood rock, he understood construction, and he told Professor Lamb that whatever had carved those passages did it with tools and techniques that he couldn't identify. Lamb spent 3 weeks in the district. He descended into the Independence, the Pharmacist, and the Strong Mine. He brought his own measuring instruments, a theodolite, calipers, and a set of mineralogical testing kits that he'd used for 15 years of fieldwork across the Rocky Mountain Survey. What he found contradicted everything he thought he knew about subterranean geology. His field notes described smooth-bore tunnels at depth that showed no drill marks, no blast patterns, and no tool scars of any kind. The walls were, in his words, polished to a degree that suggests either extreme heat treatment or a cutting method presently unknown to engineering. He measured the curvature of the tunnel walls and found them to be mathematically consistent, not roughly circular the way a bored tunnel would be, precisely circular. The deviation from a perfect circle across every measurement he took was less than 1/16 of an inch. Lamb tried to scratch the polished surface with his steel chisel. The chisel left no mark. He tried a diamond-tip scoring tool. It left a faint line that, when he examined it under a magnifying lens, appeared to self-heal within hours. He documented this 3 separate times, noting each instance with the careful skepticism of a man who didn't want to believe what he was seeing. The miners working those depths told Lamb other things too, things that didn't make it into his formal correspondence but appeared in his personal field diary. They said the tunnels hummed, not constantly but at certain times, usually at night. A low-frequency vibration that you couldn't hear so much as feel in the bones of your skull. Several men reported nosebleeds when working the deepest sections for extended shifts. Others described a feeling of disorientation, a sense that the tunnels were longer than their measurements indicated, as if distance itself behaved differently down there. Lamb dismissed most of these accounts as the natural anxiety of men working in confined spaces at dangerous depths. But he couldn't dismiss the tunnels themselves. And then Lamb found the drift. A drift, in mining terminology, is a horizontal passage that follows a vein of ore. But the drift that Lamb documented beneath the Pharmacist mine wasn't following any vein. It ran due east for approximately 600 feet, perfectly level through solid granite. No ore, no quartz, no reason by any mining logic for it to exist. At the end of the drift, Lamb found a chamber. The chamber was roughly 40 feet across and 20 feet high, with a domed ceiling that Lamb described as geometrically precise. The walls were the same polished stone as the tunnels, but the floor was different. The floor was covered in a material that Lamb couldn't identify. It wasn't stone, it wasn't metal. It was smooth, dark, and slightly warm to the touch, even at that depth where ambient temperatures should have been cool. In the centre of the chamber sat what Lamb could only describe as a chair, not a mining stool, not a natural rock formation that happened to look like a seat. A chair, carved from a single block of stone that didn't match any geological sample from the caldera. The stone was black, with veins of something that caught the lamplight and threw it back in colours that Lamb said he'd never seen in any mineral. The chair had armrests. It had a curved back, and it was positioned facing a section of wall that was different from the rest. That section of wall was perfectly flat, roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, polished to a mirror finish. Lamb wrote that when he held his lamp up to it, the surface seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He called it a throne. Now, Lamb was a geologist, not a mystic. He didn't write about ancient civilizations or lost races. His notes are clinical, measured, almost frustratingly understated. He documented dimensions, took samples of the floor material and the throne stone, and made detailed sketches of the chamber's proportions. He noted that the acoustic properties of the room were unusual. Sounds didn't echo the way they should have in a stone chamber of that size. His voice, he wrote, seemed to be absorbed by the walls in the same way the light was absorbed by the flat panel. Lamb sent his preliminary findings to the US Geological Survey in September of 1892. He recommended that the chamber be sealed off from mining operations and studied by a team of geologists and engineers. He specifically requested that no blasting occur within 500 feet of the site. The response he received, dated November 1892, was 2 sentences long. It thanked him for his correspondence and informed him that the matter had been referred to appropriate federal authorities. Nothing happened for 4 months. Then, in March of 1893, the labour situation in Cripple Creek exploded. Mine owners, led by men who'd been making fortunes off the district's extraordinary deposits, announced they were extending the workday from 8 hours to 10 hours with no increase in pay. The Western Federation of Miners organised a strike. Tensions escalated, and by June the governor of Colorado had authorised the deployment of the state militia to the district. The official history tells you the militia was sent to break the strike, and they did attempt that. There were confrontations, arrests, and at least one armed standoff at the Strong Mine. But here's what the official history doesn't tell you. The militia's orders included a classified addendum that wasn't part of the labour dispute at all. Eric Lindqvist knew about the addendum because he was working in the pharmacist mine when the soldiers arrived. Lindqvist was a drift miner, one of the men who worked the horizontal passages deep underground. He'd been in the drift that Lamb documented. He'd seen the chamber. He'd sat in the chair. In his journal, Lindqvist wrote that the chair wasn't cold, the way stone should be at 400 feet underground. It was warm. And when he sat in it, he felt a vibration that seemed to come from deep below the chamber floor. A low, steady pulse that he could feel in his teeth and in his chest. He also wrote that the flat panel on the wall, the one Lamb had described as absorbing light, changed when someone sat in the chair. Lindqvist said the surface became transparent. Not like glass. More like the stone itself became thin, and behind it he could see what he described as a passage of great length, illuminated by a source I could not determine. He sat there for what he estimated was 10 minutes. Then the vibration intensified, and he became frightened and left. He wrote that, as he walked back through the drift toward the main mine workings, the vibration followed him. Not physically, acoustically. The hum in the walls seemed to track his movement, growing softer as he moved away from the chamber, but never entirely disappearing until he'd climbed back above the 300-foot level. Lindqvist told 2 other miners about what he'd experienced, a Cornish driller named Thomas Penrose and an Irish powder man named Seamus Gallagher. Both men went down to the chamber independently over the following weeks. Penrose confirmed the warmth of the chair and the vibration. Gallagher refused to discuss what he saw, but Lindqvist noted that Gallagher quit the mine within days and left Cripple Creek entirely, moving to Leadville, where he reportedly drank himself into an early grave within 3 years. That was in February of 1893. 1 month later, the militia arrived. According to Lindqvist, the soldiers didn't go to the mine offices first. They went straight underground. A detachment of 12 men, led by a captain whose name Lindqvist recorded as Hargrove or Hargraves, descended into the pharmacist mine with equipment that wasn't standard military issue. Lindqvist described wooden crates stamped with markings he didn't recognize, heavy enough that it took 4 men to carry each one. The miners were ordered out at gunpoint, all of them. The entire pharmacist operation was shut down in a single afternoon, and armed guards were posted at every entrance. What happened underground during the next 3 days is unknown. Lindqvist wasn't there. No miner was. But on the 4th day, a series of explosions shook the ground above the pharmacist mine. Not the sharp, quick blasts of dynamite charges used in mining. These were deeper, longer, rolling detonations that Lindqvist described as sounding like the earth itself was groaning. When the dust settled, the entrance to the drift that led to the chamber was gone, collapsed, buried under hundreds of tons of granite. The soldiers left the next morning. The pharmacist mine was permanently closed. The official reason given was structural instability due to excessive blasting. No further mining permits were issued for that section of the district. Winfield Scott Stratton, who'd invited Professor Lamb to study the underground anomalies, never spoke publicly about the chamber again. But his behaviour changed dramatically. Within a year, he sold the Independence Mine for $10 million, an astronomical sum in 1894. He moved to Colorado Springs and became one of the most generous philanthropists in the state's history, donating millions to hospitals, orphanages, and public works. People who knew him said he'd become obsessed with the idea that wealth extracted from the earth carried a kind of debt. Professor Lamb resigned from the Colorado School of Mines in 1895. He moved to a small town in Vermont and never published another geological paper. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. His resignation letter, which survived in the school's archives, contained a single line that historians have never been able to explain. I have seen enough to know that what we call geology is the surface of a much deeper science. The mineral samples Lamb collected from the chamber and the throne were never located. They weren't in his personal effects when he died in 1912. They weren't in the Geological Survey's archives. They weren't at the Colorado School of Mines. They simply ceased to exist in any official record. But the journal survived. Lindqvist carried it with him when he left Cripple Creek in 1894. He settled in Colorado Springs, worked as a carpenter, raised a family, and never went underground again. His children said he refused to enter basements. He wouldn't sleep without a lamp burning. And every year, on the anniversary of the day the soldiers sealed the drift, he'd drive up to Cripple Creek alone and sit in his truck, staring at the mountain where the pharmacist mine had been. His great-granddaughter, Karen Lindqvist Moore, found the journal in 1987. She showed it to a history professor at the University of Colorado, who examined it and confirmed that the leather, the ink, and the writing style were consistent with the 1890s. The professor was initially excited. He began cross-referencing Lindqvist's account with military deployment records from 1893. What he found was disturbing. The deployment records for the Colorado militia's actions in Cripple Creek during the labor dispute were incomplete. Specifically, the records for the detachment that went to the pharmacist mine were missing entirely. Not classified, not redacted, missing, as if they'd never existed. The professor submitted a Freedom of Information request to the National Archives for any federal correspondence related to mining operations in the Cripple Creek district between 1892 and 1894. He received a response 3 months later, informing him that the relevant files had been transferred to an unspecified repository in 1903 and could not be located. The professor published a brief paper in a regional history journal in 1989. It received no attention. He was denied tenure the following year and left academia. Karen Lindqvist Moore still has the journal. She's shown it to journalists, historians, and researchers over the years. Most of them find it fascinating. None of them have been able to get any institution to investigate further, and the pharmacist mine remains sealed. Now, here's where this story intersects with a much larger pattern that's been documented across the American West, across Europe, and across parts of Asia. The Cripple Creek caldera is a volcanic formation approximately 6 miles across. It was created by a massive eruption roughly 28 million years ago. The gold deposits in the district are a direct result of that volcanic activity. Hydrothermal fluids pushing mineral-rich solutions through fractures in the rock over millions of years. But the polished tunnels, the geometrically precise chamber, and the throne don't fit that geological model. Hydrothermal activity doesn't create smooth-walled passages, volcanic breccia doesn't polish itself, and granite doesn't form into chairs. Critics will say that Lindqvist's journal is unreliable, that Lamb's letter could have been exaggerated, that the missing records are just bureaucratic incompetence. And those are all reasonable objections. But consider the pattern. In 1901, miners in Butte, Montana, broke through a wall at the 3,000-foot level and found a sealed chamber containing stone implements that the Smithsonian's initial assessment described as of unknown origin and manufacture. The implements were sent to Washington. They disappeared from the collection within 5 years. In 1908, a tunnel crew working on a railroad bore in the Cascade Range of Washington State encountered a section of polished stone wall at a depth of 600 feet. The wall ran for approximately 40 feet before the tunnel was rerouted around it by order of the railroad's chief engineer. The engineer's report noted the wall's existence but offered no explanation. The section was sealed with concrete. In 1924, miners in the Harz Mountains of Germany, working a silver mine that had been in continuous operation since the Middle Ages, discovered a descending staircase at depth that had been sealed with a type of merite that didn't match any known recipe from the region. When they cleared the seal, they found a passage that ran straight for nearly half a mile before opening into what the mine foreman described as a hall. The German government closed the mine 6 months later, citing safety concerns. It never reopened. The foreman, a man named Wilhelm Drescher, wrote to colleagues in the Freiburg Mining Academy describing the hall as containing stone plinths arranged in a semicircle, each one topped with a shallow basin. The basins contained a residue that chemical analysis at the time couldn't identify. Drescher's letter was found in the Academy's correspondence archive in 2003. No follow-up investigation has ever been conducted. And in 1937, copper miners near Bisbee, Arizona, working the Campbell shaft at over 2,000 feet, broke into a sealed cavity that contained what the shift supervisor's report described as carved stone benches arranged around a central column. The column was made of a material the supervisor said resembled obsidian but was translucent, and it appeared to emit a faint luminescence that persisted even after all lamps in the cavity were extinguished. The Phelps Dodge Corporation, which owned the mine, sealed the cavity with concrete within 48 hours. The shift supervisor was transferred to a surface position and signed a non-disclosure agreement. His report was obtained through a 1984 lawsuit related to mining safety records. The pattern is consistent. Underground anomalies discovered during mining operations, structures that don't match the surrounding geology, official intervention that results in sealing, closure, and the disappearance of documentation. The revisionist interpretation of these discoveries challenges a fundamental assumption that mainstream archaeology and geology take for granted. That assumption is simple. Whatever existed before recorded history was primitive, that anything underground was either natural or was carved by people using simple tools over long periods of time. But the evidence from Cripple Creek and dozens of similar sites suggests something very different. It suggests that the underground infrastructure of certain regions was built by a civilization or civilizations with engineering capabilities that we don't fully understand. Capabilities that included precision stone cutting without tool marks, acoustic engineering that suppressed echo and reverberation, and material science that produced substances our geologists can't identify. The mainstream response to these claims is predictable. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence, they argue, isn't there. The samples are missing, the records are gone, the mines are sealed. But that's precisely the point, isn't it? The evidence isn't missing because it never existed. It's missing because someone removed it. Systematically. Repeatedly. Across multiple decades and multiple countries. The question isn't whether these underground structures exist. Too many independent witnesses from too many different times and places have described the same things. Polished walls, precise geometry, unknown materials, thrones, chairs, altars, panels that respond to human presence. The question is why someone went to such extraordinary lengths to make sure we never found out about them. In the case of Cripple Creek, the answer might lie in what the caldera actually is. 28 million years ago, a volcano erupted with enough force to create a 6-mile wide crater. The official geology says that's all that happened: an eruption, a collapse, and then millions of years of mineral deposition. But what if the eruption didn't create the crater? What if the eruption destroyed something that was already there? The volcanic breccia that fills the caldera, the broken, chaotic rock that gold miners spent decades blasting through, could be interpreted differently, not as the natural debris of an eruption, but as the rubble of a catastrophic destruction event, an event that buried whatever had existed in that basin under millions of tons of volcanic rock. And then, millions of years later, the gold that formed in the fractures drew miners down to the exact depth where the remnants of that buried civilization still existed. Eric Lindqvist sat in a chair that was warm to the touch, 400 feet underground, inside a chamber that shouldn't exist. He looked through a wall that became transparent and saw a passage lit by a light source that he couldn't explain. Professor Henry Lamb, a man trained in the most rigorous scientific traditions of the 19th century, examined that same chamber and concluded that it was built using methods presently unknown to engineering. And the United States military sealed it shut and destroyed every record of its existence. What are they protecting? Not a gold deposit, not a military secret, not a matter of national security in any conventional sense. They're protecting a story. The story that says human civilization began 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and has been progressing upward ever since. The story that says everything before recorded history was primitive, scattered, and incapable of engineering feats that would challenge our own. Because if there's a throne carved from unknown stone inside a geometrically perfect chamber beneath 400 feet of volcanic rock in the mountains of Colorado, then that story isn't just incomplete, it's wrong. The Pharmacist mine sits at approximately 9,400 feet elevation on the western slope of the Caldera Basin. The entrance, or what's left of it, is on private land now. The property changed hands multiple times after the mine closed, and the current owners have posted it against trespassing. There are no mining claims active on the site. There are no geological surveys pending. There is no institutional interest of any kind. The drift that led to the chamber is buried under what mining engineers estimate to be 300 to 500 tons of collapsed granite. To reach it again would require either boring a new tunnel from a different approach or removing the debris from the original passage. Either option would cost millions of dollars and require permits that no regulatory agency has any incentive to grant. Karen Lindqvist Moore is in her 70s now. She keeps her great-grandfather's journal in a fireproof safe in her home outside Colorado Springs. She's made copies. She's digitized the pages. She's shared them with anyone who's willing to look. She once drove to Washington, D.C. and hand-delivered a copy to the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. She received a form letter 6 weeks later thanking her for her interest in geological history and informing her that the museum's priorities did not include the Cripple Creek district. But looking and acting are different things. The institutions that could investigate, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Smithsonian, the Bureau of Land Management, university archaeology departments, none of them have expressed any interest. When asked directly, their responses range from polite dismissal to uncomfortable silence. Because investigating would mean admitting the possibility that the official geological and archaeological narrative of the American West is incomplete. And if it's incomplete here in Cripple Creek, then it might be incomplete in Butte, in the Cascades, in the Hartz Mountains, and in every other place where miners have broken through into spaces that shouldn't exist and found things that can't be explained. The drift below Cripple Creek is still down there. The chamber is still down there, and if Lindqvist's journal is accurate, the throne is still down there, warm to the touch, waiting in the dark, 400 feet below a mountain that the Ute people warned us about centuries ago, the place where the earth bleeds, and we sealed it shut because we were afraid of what the blood might tell us. The history you were taught begins with agriculture, settlements, and the slow climb from primitive to modern. But the history beneath your feet, literally beneath your feet, tells a different story. A story written in polished stone, in precision geometry, and in materials that our best laboratories can't name. 130 years ago, a Swedish miner sat on a throne that shouldn't exist and watched a wall turn transparent. 12 soldiers went underground with unmarked crates. The earth groaned. And then silence. Nobody has gone back. Not because they can't, because they won't. Because going back means asking questions that dismantle the version of the past we've built our entire civilization on. And maybe that's the real reason the Cavalry came to Cripple Creek in 1893. Not to break a strike, not to protect gold, but to protect a story. The story that we're the first. The story that nothing came before us. The story that the underground is just rock and mineral and darkness. But Eric Lindqvist knew better. He felt the pulse in his chest, he saw the light behind the wall, and he spent the rest of his life unable to sleep without a lamp burning. Because once you've seen what's beneath the surface, the dark never feels the same again.